My name is Margaret Hale, and at 62 years old, I learned that people often mistake modesty for weakness until the day they realize just how mistaken they were. I have lived in the same small, aging house for nearly 30 years, long enough for the walls to memorize my footsteps and the floorboards to sigh whenever I cross them at dawn. Some mornings, when the light hits the windows at the right angle, the chipped paint almost looks charming. To most people on my street, though, it is simply old, much like me. My days begin the same way they always have, quietly. I water the garden before the sun climbs over the rooftops, turning the soil with hands that have known decades of work, first as a school administrator, then as a widow trying to rebuild a life she never expected to navigate alone. I wear the same gardening hat I bought secondhand 10 years ago, and if it has lost its shape, it has gained a kind of familiarity that feels like home. I have never cared much for appearances. I buy my clothes from thrift stores because they last longer than people assume, and I drive a car so old the neighborhood children joke that it belongs in a museum. When the weather is kind, I walk to the grocery store instead of driving, a habit that leads to whispers I overhear more often than they realize. Maybe she can't afford gas. Do you think she's lonely? She always walks alone. Perhaps she's just stuck. None of them consider that I simply enjoy the quiet. My neighbors smile at me when they see me, but the kindness rarely reaches their eyes. The Parkers, who live 3 houses down, are a perfect example. Linda Parker cannot step outside without wearing something that sparkles, and her husband, Ronald, speaks as though every sentence is part of a sales pitch. They host loud parties in their manicured backyard and behave as though their new patio pergola is listed among the 7 wonders of the world. They are the sort of people who believe wealth is loud, visible, and validated only when others take notice. Then there is Denise Miller, the neighborhood's self-appointed queen of real estate and frequent dispenser of unsolicited advice. She is polished in a way that feels less like self-care and more like performance. Anyone who doesn't meet her standard of presentable is treated as a small inconvenience standing in the way of the image she cultivates. Over the years, I have overheard the 3 of them whisper about me. Nothing overt or cruel enough to justify confrontation, but steady, persistent judgment. A comment about my peeling window frames, a sigh when my old car rattles down the street, a mocking imitation of my thrift store tote bag. They spoke as though I couldn't hear them, as though my age meant my ears no longer worked, as though simplicity equaled invisibility. But I have always been attentive. It is a skill that comes naturally when one has spent decades taking notes in meetings, analyzing budgets, and observing people without announcing it. I remained composed. I said nothing. I believed that not every slight deserved a response. Still, memory is its own kind of recording device, and mine has always been meticulous. The whispers grew bolder each year. When I walked into the local thrift shop one afternoon, I caught Denise standing near the entrance, talking to a younger agent she was mentoring. She's sweet, but honestly, she's practically living at poverty level. If she ever needs to sell that house, it'll be a charity case. Poor woman. I paused behind the rack of blouses long enough for the sting to settle. Then I pulled out the exact sweater I needed and continued browsing. No reaction, no glancing over my shoulder, just a quiet acknowledgement of how confidently people build entire narratives about a life they've never bothered to understand. The Parkers weren't much better. One evening when I returned from a walk, I passed them as they were arranging new patio furniture. I heard she refuses to renovate because she can't afford it, Linda whispered loudly enough for me to catch. Well, she's getting older, Ronald replied. Maybe she's waiting for a retirement home to take her in. I continued walking, my expression calm, even as something deep inside me tightened. Their assumptions were wrong, laughably wrong, but I had no interest in correcting them. I had my reasons for living the way I did, reasons far more complex than they could imagine. Still, there are moments when even the most composed woman reaches a limit. That moment came on a crisp October afternoon when I was trimming the rosemary in my front yard. A young couple walked by, friends of the Parkers, judging by the way they waved at their house, and the woman tilted her head toward me. "She'll never amount to anything living like that," she said, as though I were a piece of scenery instead of a person. That one landed differently, not because it hurt, but because of the boldness with which she declared it, as if a life could be measured by the shine of a front door or the price of a dress. I didn't respond. I didn't glare. I simply set down my gardening shears and stood still for a moment, letting the words dissolve into the cool air. Then I resumed trimming the rosemary, slower this time, thoughtful. Because the truth was this. I knew exactly why I lived modestly. I knew what my bank statement said, what documents I kept carefully filed in my cabinet, what assets I had tracked and grown over the years. The life they thought they were seeing was only a sliver of the whole. And though I had no desire to prove anything to them, life has a way of bringing hidden truths into the light when the right moment arrives. That moment came the next morning, as I was sweeping fallen leaves from the front steps. A mail truck rolled to a stop, and the carrier, someone I'd known since his first day on the job, walked toward me, with a certified letter in hand. "For you, Margaret. Needs a signature." I signed, thanked him, and stepped back into the house, closing the door behind me. For a long moment, I simply looked at the envelope. Then slowly, deliberately, I opened it. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from opportunity, the kind that arrives only once in a lifetime, and with one quiet breath, I knew everything around me was about to change. That envelope contained the culmination of 30 years of patience and the beginning of my quiet, calculated justice. I sat at my kitchen table with the certified letter resting between my palms. The envelope was thin, unassuming, its weight almost insulting given how much it contained. A lifetime of choices, sacrifices, and self-discipline distilled into a few typed paragraphs. When I finally unfolded the document, the words blurred before settling into sharp clarity. Final transfer complete. Portfolio liquidation successful. Available balance $1,147,260. I exhaled so slowly it felt like releasing a decade of breath all at once. My financial advisor, Daniel, had been with me through the entire journey. He was a patient man with a calm voice and a quiet belief in discipline. The letter confirmed that all the funds from my long-term investments had moved exactly where they needed to be, into a single liquid account where I could access them freely for the first time in my life. It was done. After 30 years, it was finally done. Most people in my neighborhood saw me as a woman who barely scraped by. What they didn't realize was that while they were buying new cars every few years, chasing trends, and living loudly for the sake of appearance, I was doing something far less glamorous. I was investing. Slowly, consistently. Sometimes only $50 at a time. Mutual funds at first, then index funds, then a few conservative stocks recommended by Daniel. I had studied books on finance the way some people study cookbooks, quietly, with purpose, repeating lessons until they became instinct. And I had worked, harder than anyone knew. I spent decades in the school district office, managing budgets, supporting teachers, documenting everything in tidy files. It wasn't thrilling work, but it was honest and steady, and it allowed me to save more than most. My late husband, Michael, shared my mindset. We made plans together the way other couples planned vacations, charts, ledgers, goals for the future. We were never wealthy, but we were diligent. And diligence, like water, reshapes landscapes when given enough time. When he died suddenly, 21 years ago, something inside me shifted, but not in the way people expected. I didn't collapse. I didn't lose my way. I preserved our plan like a sacred promise. Every time I invested, every time I withheld myself from frivolous purchases, every time I walked instead of drove, I felt him there beside me, steadying me, reminding me that simplicity had always been our path to freedom. I ran my finger gently along the line denoting the final balance. Crossing over the $1 million mark felt surreal. Not because money itself thrilled me, but because of what it represented. The proof that a quiet life can be powerful, intentional, and astonishing in its own way. I set the letter down and leaned back in my chair. Outside, I could hear the Parkers' laughter drifting across the street, loud and performative as always. Their voices carried the tone of people who believed they had the world figured out, the kind who assumed they were at the top because they were the loudest. I smiled. Not bitterly, just knowingly. I had never flaunted my finances because I never needed to. Wealth, to me, had always been a private form of security, not a public performance. I valued dignity, not spectacle. And I understood something that few of my neighbors ever would. When you show your wealth, you invite both envy and predators. But when you hold it quietly, you hold your power. My little house, with its creaking pipes and patched-up roof, had never been a symbol of lack. It was a sanctuary of strategy. It allowed me to grow my resources without drawing unnecessary attention. It allowed me to choose how and when the truth would reveal itself. And now, finally, it was time. I opened my laptop, a second-hand model I purchased years ago, and began searching. Not for cars, not for jewelry, not for vacations, for something else entirely. The property appeared in a real estate listing as if waiting for me. A historic estate on the edge of town, built nearly a century ago, set on 3 acres of land with old oaks sprawling across the yard. It needed restoration, but its bones were magnificent. Arched windows, carved stone, and a charm that felt almost cinematic. The asking price, $1.1 million. I stared at the listing longer than I intended. The house reminded me not of luxury, but of legacy, a place to spend the rest of my life restoring something meaningful. A house with history, character, and a kind of quiet resilience I felt deep in my bones. Buying it would shock the community, of course. Not because I wanted to, but because the irony would be undeniable. The woman they whispered about, the one they mocked for walking to the store and wearing thrifted sweaters, would own the most remarkable home in town. The thought didn't fill me with vindictive joy. It simply settled into me like a subtle, poetic justice life had arranged on my behalf. A balance I hadn't demanded, but one I deeply understood. Still, I wasn't reckless. I researched thoroughly, comparing market prices, renovation estimates, neighborhood value growth. I calculated long-term expenses, insurance costs, and tax implications, not because I doubted my capacity, but because caution had always been my compass. Wealth had not changed me. It had only given me a wider horizon. After 2 hours of research, I made the call. "Hello, I'd like to schedule a private viewing for the property on Westbridge Lane." The receptionist asked for my details and placed me on a brief hold. When she returned, her voice was bright, professional. "Absolutely. We can arrange that for Thursday afternoon. The agent assigned to the property will meet you there. Her name is Denise Miller." I went still. Denise? My neighbor? The woman who had spent years mocking my simplicity. The woman who believed I belonged in a charity case listing. The woman who judged me with a single glance every time she passed my home. A slow, quiet breath filled me. "I'll be there," I said. "Please confirm the appointment in writing." As I ended the call, a calm certainty settled through me, not vindictive, but resolute. Life, it seemed, had a flawless sense of timing, and sometimes the truth arrives without sound, just a letter, a balance sheet, and a scheduled meeting that changes everything. The confirmation email appeared moments later. I clicked it open and read the name again. Showing agent, Denise Miller. I closed my laptop, folded the financial letter carefully, and placed it in my desk drawer. The stage was set, and Denise had no idea what was coming. Denise didn't recognize me at first. She was too busy preparing for a serious buyer. I let the moment settle like dust before a storm. I arrived at the Westbridge property 5 minutes early, wearing the same sort of outfit I always did. Dark slacks, a simple cream blouse, and my worn cardigan that had survived more years than I cared to count. My shoes were practical, not elegant. My hair, pinned back the way I had done it every morning for years, had no interest in impressing anyone. The long driveway curved beneath towering oaks that rustled softly in the wind. Sunlight filtered through their branches, scattering broken gold across the gravel. The historic house stood tall in the distance, dignified even in its age. My heart lifted at the sight of it. There was a steadiness to its silhouette, a promise of history preserved and yet waiting to be rebuilt. Near the front steps stood Denise. She was dressed impeccably, of course. Charcoal blazer, pointed heels, designer handbag glinting in the sun. Her hair was styled in loose curls that had clearly taken time and intention. She glanced at her phone, lips pursed, expression strained with the particular impatience of a realtor expecting a lucrative client. She did not look up when I approached, not at first. When she finally lifted her eyes, her smile faltered. Just slightly, but enough. "Oh," she said, blinking. "Margaret, are you lost?" I offered her a polite nod. "Good afternoon, Denise." She stepped forward with the hurried concern one might show a confused tourist. "This is a private showing, for the Westbridge property. Did someone tell you to meet them here? The open houses for other listings are on Saturday, not today." I let out a quiet breath, steady and nonchalant. "I'm aware. I'm here for the showing." Her brows knitted tightly. "For this house?" "Yes." She gave a small laugh, soft and patronizing. "Mrs. Hale, I don't want you to feel embarrassed, but this property is listed at over $1 million. If you'd like, I can show you something more aligned with your—" "My appointment is at 2, I interrupted gently. "Confirmed by your office." Her expression froze. She stared at me for a long beat, the realization settling slowly, painfully, like cold water leaking through fabric. "You're the buyer?" she finally asked. "I'm the prospective buyer," I said. "I thought we could begin the tour." A flush crept up her neck, tightening the edges of her smile. "Of course. I just wanted to be sure you understood the price point. Have you, secured pre-approval?" Her tone carried the brittle edge of disbelief. I reached calmly into my bag and pulled out the required documentation: bank statements, proof of funds, a letter from my advisor confirming cash liquidity. I handed them to her with both hands, not out of ceremony, but to steady hers. They were trembling. She scanned the documents quickly at first, then again, slower, as though trying to find the trick hidden between the lines. "Oh," she breathed. These are certainly in order." "I assumed they would be," I replied. The transformation in her posture was almost theatrical. Her shoulders straightened, her voice sharpened with sudden professionalism. She motioned toward the door. "Let's begin." We stepped into a grand foyer where dust hovered in strips of sunlight like suspended time. The ceilings arched above us, vaulted, hand-carved, and impossibly beautiful given the neglect. The air smelled faintly of old wood and possibility. As we walked from room to room, I felt myself falling deeper into a quiet, steady awe. The fireplaces, the original crown molding, the sprawling staircase with its ornate banister. Each detail whispered stories older than any of us. "This home will need significant renovation," Denise said pointedly as we reached the dining hall. "Restoration of this magnitude is extremely costly, sometimes unrealistic for certain buyers." I smiled gently. Fortunately, I'm fond of long-term projects. She blinked, thrown off by my consistency. "Yes, but many buyers underestimate—" "I won't." She cleared her throat and moved on quickly, heels clacking against worn hardwood. I trailed behind her, taking photos with my phone, not to prove anything, not to flaunt my interest, but simply to begin planning. The walls needed stabilizing. The kitchen required a full update. The garden could be revived with time and patience. Each flaw felt like a promise I wanted to keep. We stepped into the sunroom, where vines crept across the windows like ink strokes. The light here was magnificent. Denise gave the room a perfunctory glance before turning back to me. "So," she said, feigning nonchalance, "are you sure this isn't too much house for one person? Many older buyers prefer something simpler, closer to assisted living options." I met her gaze calmly. "I prefer space, and I don't intend to move into assisted living anytime soon." She didn't know how to respond. Silence filled the room. I turned to her, tilting my head slightly. "Denise, what's your commission on a home like this?" She blinked rapidly, the question catching her off guard. "Well, that depends, but it's substantial." "I see." I let the weight of that settle, not as a threat, but as a simple truth returning to its source. Before she could respond, her phone rang. She glanced down, face tightening when she saw the caller ID. She stepped away to answer it, voice pitched low but not low enough. "Yes, this is Denise." "Yes, I'm with her right now." "She is? Approved?" I watched her shoulders stiffen. The voice on the other end grew louder, clearer, impossible to miss. Yes, the offer is finalized. Contract is ready. Inform the buyer. Congratulations. Denise inhaled sharply. Her eyes met mine, wide, disbelieving, and for the first time in all the years I'd known her, utterly speechless. I folded my hands gently in front of me, because the listing agent wasn't calling to ask questions. They were calling to confirm my offer had already been approved. The look on Denise's face was the first quiet victory, but far from the last. For a moment after that phone call, the sunroom felt impossibly still, as though even the dust motes had paused midair to witness Denise's unraveling composure. She lowered her phone slowly, her expression frozen between disbelief and frantic calculation. When she finally spoke, her voice was pitched with forced brightness. "Well," she said, swallowing hard, "it seems things have moved very quickly." "Yes," I replied gently, "that was my intention." What she didn't know, at least not yet, was that I had submitted my offer the night before through a different agent at the firm, a woman named Marjorie who treated me with respect long before she saw my bank statements. I offered the full price, $1.1 million, in cash, specifically to secure the property without delay and without negotiation games. I wanted that house, and I had no desire to dance through unnecessary hoops. Cash purchases have a way of cutting through red tape. The seller accepted within hours. When Denise realized she had not been the one to facilitate the transaction, her smile stretched thinner, fragile as brittle glass. I could almost see the thoughts racing behind her eyes. The commission she had missed, the assumptions she had made, the humiliation of being blindsided by a woman she'd dismissed for years, but I held her gaze calmly, offering nothing but steady politeness. Dignity, after all, is the most quiet and unsettling form of power. As we walked back toward the front of the house, Denise attempted to regain footing. Her tone softened, sugar-sweet in a way I'd never heard from her. "You know, Margaret, I've always admired your simple lifestyle. It's refreshing. Most people these days are so caught up in appearances." I simply nodded. "Yes, I've noticed. And this home, well, it's perfect for someone with your grounded nature. I'm sure you'll do wonderful things with it." Her voice quivered at the edges, as though struggling to hold its shape. "I appreciate that, Denise. Oh, and if you need any help with renovation recommendations or contractor referrals, I'd be happy to." "I already have people in mind," I said gently. The silence that followed was delicate, almost tender in its discomfort. Outside, the wind had picked up, scattering leaves across the driveway. Denise stepped aside as I descended the front steps, her eyes lingering on me, as though seeing me for the first time, or perhaps trying to understand how she had failed to see me all these years. When I returned home later that afternoon, I noticed movement across the street. The Parkers stood in their yard, pretending to adjust their garden lights, though their attention was fixed squarely on me. Their curiosity had been stirred by Denise's frantic phone calls earlier, which apparently had not gone unnoticed. Linda's eyebrows lifted when I met her gaze, but instead of waving, she quickly turned away, whispering something to her husband. Word travels fast in neighborhoods where people have little to do but observe. I wasted no time before scheduling the final paperwork. The next morning, I arrived at the real estate office, where Marjorie, professional and warm, greeted me with a handshake. "We're thrilled to finalize everything for you, Mrs. Hale. Congratulations." Her sincerity comforted me. Together we reviewed documents with clarity and precision. When I signed the last page, a wave of quiet satisfaction washed over me. Steady, deep, earned. Not triumph, not revenge, just fulfillment. As we stood, Marjorie leaned closer. "Between you and me," she whispered, "Denise is beside herself. But I think you handled her better than most. Respectfully, but powerfully." "I tried to be fair," I replied. "Even when others are not, fairness costs me nothing." From the office, I drove directly to the library to study the history of my new property. I discovered archived photos from the 1930s, notes about previous owners, records of the land's original boundaries. I spent hours reading, tracing the story of the house through decades of transitions, prosperity, hardship, near abandonment. Each chapter mirrored something in me, something that understood what it meant to endure quietly. Over the next few days, I researched contractors, architects, and preservation specialists. I read reviews, studied recommendations, and compiled a detailed renovation plan. My notebook filled with sketches, budget outlines, timelines. I had waited years for this moment. I would not approach it carelessly. When Daniel, my financial advisor, called to congratulate me, his voice carried genuine pride. "You did it, Margaret. Exactly the way you always said you would." "I did," I said softly. "Thank you for guiding me all these years." "You guided yourself," he replied. "I only confirmed what you already knew." That evening, as I arrived home carrying folders of renovation ideas, I found Denise waiting on the sidewalk. Her posture was stiff and her smile wary. "Margaret, I just wanted to talk," she began, adjusting her blazer even though it was perfectly straight. "Some of the neighbors are concerned. They think such a major purchase might affect the property values or disrupt the neighborhood dynamics." "I'm not interested in gossip, Denise," I said calmly, "and I don't make life decisions based on neighborhood insecurities." She blinked rapidly, taken aback. "I only meant, I know what you meant," I said, soft but immovable, "and you don't need to worry." After a moment, she took a step back, forced another smile, and retreated toward her house, her heels echoing against the pavement. 2 days later, the whispers turned into something louder. My mail carrier paused at my gate, shaking his head with amazement as he handed me the morning paper. "You made the front page, Margaret. Half the town's talking." I unfolded the paper slowly. Across the top, in bold, unapologetic letters, was the headline, "Long-time resident makes 1.1 net on cash purchase." A small photograph of the historic property accompanied the story, and beneath it, a brief summary of the unexpected buyer, a quiet, long-standing member of the community known for her modest lifestyle. I closed the paper, the cool morning air pressing gently against my skin. The town finally knew, and they had no idea what this revelation would unravel next. By sunrise, my street felt different, like everyone's eyes had finally opened, but too late to change what they'd already said. The morning after the headline ran, I woke to the persistent blinking of notifications on my phone. Dozens of missed calls from co-workers I hadn't spoken to in years, emails from distant cousins, text messages from acquaintances whose names I barely remembered. Some offered congratulations soaked in disbelief. Others asked outright for details, how I'd done it, why I hadn't said anything, whether it was true I'd paid in cash. I set the phone face down on the table and brewed my tea as I always did. Vanilla chamomile, steeped for precisely 4 minutes. A small routine that felt almost absurdly normal considering the citywide chatter now circling around my name. When I stepped outside for my morning walk, the neighborhood was already stirring. Curtains that rarely moved were suddenly drawn back. People lingered on porches a bit too conveniently. Conversations paused as I passed, and eyes followed me, the way children follow a magician's sleight of hand, blinking, curious, unsure of what they were seeing. The cold air bit softly at my cheeks as I walked my usual route. It was the same path I'd taken for years, down the cracked sidewalk, past the vacant lot with its stubborn weeds, around the bend where the oak trees grew in uneven clusters. Yet something had shifted. Each footstep felt like a statement now, each quiet breath observed. Halfway down the street, the Parkers appeared from behind their gate, grinning with the kind of enthusiasm that never reached the corners of the eyes. "Margaret," Linda called, a little too loudly. "Wonderful morning, isn't it?" I slowed, out of courtesy rather than desire. "Yes, it is." Ronald joined her, hands shoved into the pockets of his impeccably pressed slacks. "Saw the paper," he said, smiling as if he'd been personally responsible for the headline. "Quite something. Congratulations." Linda clasped her hands dramatically. "Truly, we always knew you had potential." Potential. The word hung between us like a poorly tuned piano note. I smiled gently. "Thank you." "So," Ronald said with feigned casualness, "this must have been a big inheritance, right? Or a lucky investment? Or, well, something of that nature?" I offered a soft shrug. "Life has a way of unfolding." He blinked, unsatisfied. "And that house," Linda gushed. "It's enormous. Are you sure it won't be too much to maintain on your own? You could have told us you were planning something so extravagant. I rarely speak about things until they're done, I said. It saves everyone the speculation. Her smile quivered, uncertain whether she'd been subtly corrected. Before they could probe further, I excused myself and continued walking. As I moved down the street, I overheard the unmistakable voice of Denise drifting from her driveway. She must have inherited it suddenly, she was telling someone, loudly enough that I could hear every word. There's no other explanation. She's lived so simply all these years. It's obvious she wasn't financially savvy enough to do this on her own. I didn't turn around. I didn't flinch. And I didn't correct her, not even in my mind. Letting people reveal themselves is often the deepest form of clarity. As I walked, memory tugged at the edges of my thoughts, pulling me gently back to the early years of my... Michael and I had lived with intentional frugality long before it became fashionable. Our first apartment had mismatched furniture, secondhand dishes, and a table he built himself out of scrap wood. We clipped coupons. We attended free community workshops. We bought only what we needed. People assumed we were struggling, but we were saving, slowly, methodically, stubbornly. I remembered the nights we sat at that handmade table, poring over a financial book he'd borrowed from the library. He'd point to charts and say, "We're not aiming for wealth, Maggie. We're aiming for freedom." When he died, that table became an altar of sorts. Every budget I created afterward, every investment decision, every moment of restraint was a small tribute to him. Yet all the neighbors could ever see was the surface, the worn cardigan, the old car, the empty driveway. They measured my life by visual cues, not by the depth of what I had built privately. As I returned from my walk, a few neighbors who had never spoken more than a rushed hello suddenly waved with bright eagerness. "Morning, Margaret. Lovely day. Call me if you ever need renovation advice. We should have coffee sometime." I acknowledged each with a polite nod, offering nothing more. Their friendliness rolled toward me like a tide that had conveniently forgotten it once receded. Later that afternoon, I found a flyer tucked under my door. A neighborhood meeting. The Parker's house. Attendance encouraged. The wording was neutral, almost formal, but the emphasis on inclusion felt less like an invitation and more like an expectation. I considered ignoring it, but curiosity nudged me, quiet but persistent. I had lived next to these people for decades. If they wanted to discuss the largest purchase the neighborhood had seen in years, they could at least do it in front of me. The meeting was scheduled for 7. I arrived on time, stepping into the Parkers' spotless living room, which smelled faintly of lemon polish and staged hospitality. Neighbors clustered in small groups, whispering, glancing in my direction, then looking away quickly. Linda cleared her throat. "Let's get started, shall we?" Everyone sat. I remained standing, waiting. She clasped her hands together with theatrical earnestness. "Margaret, thank you for coming. This meeting, well, it's actually about you." The room shifted, the sound of people inhaling or stiffening, unsure of what would follow. I lifted my chin slightly. "About me?" "Yes," Ronald added. "There are concerns, questions, changes you might bring. We thought it best to discuss them openly." I folded my hands calmly in front of me, letting the weight of their words settle. Concerns, changes, about me. The irony was almost beautiful. They had spent years overlooking me, yet now, suddenly, my existence was disruptive. I looked around the room, meeting each pair of uneasy eyes. "Very well," I said quietly. "Let's hear what worries you." And the room fell into a tense, expectant silence. If they wanted to discuss me, then they could do it in front of me, and I would listen, the way they never did. The moment I stepped into the Parkers' living room, the whispers rose like the soft hiss of a boiling kettle, quiet but unmistakable, fueled by curiosity, anxiety, and envy in equal measure. The room was packed more tightly than any neighborhood meeting I'd ever attended. Every face seemed carefully arranged into a mask of polite concern, but the eyes betrayed everything: discomfort, shock, suspicion. Linda Parker, positioned at the center of the room like an actress preparing for her cue, smoothed the front of her blouse before forcing a smile in my direction. "Thank you for coming, Margaret," she said, her tone rich with practiced sweetness. We thought it would be good to talk openly, just to make sure the neighborhood stays harmonious. Whispers rippled around us. Ronald stepped forward, clasping his hands behind his back with a politician's seriousness. "We're all very proud of your new purchase," he began, though the word proud hung in the air like smoke, insincere and suffocating. "But large changes can shift neighborhood dynamics, and we want to make sure you understand the responsibilities involved." Responsibilities. A clever word to disguise their discomfort. I nodded once, slowly. "I'm listening." Denise, who had been hovering near the mantel as though unsure whether she was guest or host, crossed her arms tightly. "It's just that this historic property is a tremendous undertaking," she said, voice low, dripping with deliberate subtlety. "It requires sophistication and preparation. Many people wouldn't be fully ready for something so complex." Several neighbors nodded in agreement, their expressions sympathetic, the way people look at a child about to make a grave mistake. Others chimed in quickly. "Well, renovations might create noise," someone muttered. "And traffic," another added. "It could disrupt the look of the neighborhood. There's also the worry about gentrification, or devaluing the area, depending on how you renovate." The contradictions layered on top of each other. Too wealthy, not wealthy enough. A risk of elevating property values too much, or lowering them if I made the wrong decisions. Concern disguised as guidance. Guidance wrapped around envy. Envy painted as civic duty. I opened the small notebook I'd brought with me, one I used as naturally as another woman might clutch a pearl necklace. I began recording their comments, not hurriedly, but with deliberate, measured strokes of my pen. The room grew uneasy. Linda cleared her throat. "Margaret," she said, softening her voice, "we just want to make sure you're capable of handling everything. This is quite different from your current home." I looked up from my notes. "Capable?" I repeated gently. "In what sense?" She blinked, unable to articulate the assumption beneath her words, so I continued writing. As their list of concerns stretched on, noise, change, traffic, visual consistency, I lifted my gaze and asked my first question. "What specifically worries you about historical preservation?" Silence. A few exchanged nervous glances, realizing they didn't actually know anything about it. I wrote that down. They tried again. "Well, the budget must be enormous, Margaret." I nodded. "Yes, it will be. But why do you assume I haven't planned for that?" The question landed like a pebble breaking the surface of still water, small but with widening impact. A few looked embarrassed. Others bristled. Next question. "Which part of my purchase do you feel threatens your property values?" More silence. Discomfort thickened in the air. I could feel them reassessing me, recalibrating the version of me they'd held for years. The quiet woman, the simple one, the harmless one. They had built entire narratives around their assumptions, and now those narratives were unraveling with every calm word I spoke. I closed my notebook gently. "Allow me to share my intentions," I said. The room shifted toward me as though drawn by gravity. "My goal is preservation," I continued, "not replacement. The historic character of the home will remain intact. I'll be hiring local craftsmen and restoration experts, supporting our community rather than outsourcing talent." A few faces softened. "I intend to restore the garden with native plants. I plan to host open house tours when renovations are complete, to raise funds for local charities. I'll also volunteer with the Historical Society, since they've been seeking new members." The neighbors exchanged glances, some surprised, some impressed, some quietly ashamed. "I don't intend to disrupt the neighborhood," I finished. "I intend to contribute to it." For a moment, no one spoke. The tension dissipated into something else. Respect, perhaps, or at least recognition. Even the Parkers seemed unsure how to justify their earlier concerns. Their expressions softened into reluctant acceptance. But Denise could not let the moment pass without reclaiming control. She took a small step forward, her chin tilting upward with feigned sympathy. "Margaret, I'm glad you have plans," she said. "Truly, but you must understand, perception matters. People still worry because, well, appearances tell a lot, and you've always presented yourself so She hesitated, searching for a word that wouldn't immediately expose her cruelty. Simply, she finished. A few neighbors winced. Her meaning wasn't subtle. It was a direct jab at the thrift store bags, the old car, the patched cardigan, the masking tape on my window frame. She wanted to remind everyone of the version of me she believed was still true, the version she needed to believe in order to preserve her sense of superiority. I closed my notebook and slid the pen beside it. Then, very calmly, I reached into my bag and pulled out a document. I placed it on the coffee table in front of me, flat, deliberate, unmistakable. Every conversation halted, every whisper dissolved. Even the room seemed to hold its breath, because they recognized what kind of document it was, not by its contents, not yet, but by its weight, its binding, its cold, indisputable authority. I met their wide eyes calmly. "Before we continue," I said, "there's something I believe you should see." And the room froze in stunned silence. I always believed in documentation, not for revenge, but for clarity. And clarity, that night, burned brighter than any outrage ever could. The room remained suspended in silence as the binder rested on the Parkers' pristine coffee table. No one reached for it. No one dared to breathe too loudly. Even the air felt cautious, as though aware of the boundary about to be crossed. I opened it myself, not for theatrics, simply because it was mine to reveal. "I want to be clear," I began, my voice steady even as a hush fell deeper over the room. "I did not bring this to shame anyone. I brought it because context matters. Respect matters, and tonight I believe clarity will serve us better than speculation." The first page was a dated entry, written in neat penmanship. July 14th, 11 years ago. Linda Parker comments loudly about my lowering property values due to unpainted window frames. I watched Linda's face drain of color. Ronald shifted beside her, his jaw tensing. I turned the page. October 2nd, 8 years ago. Denise Miller tells a prospective buyer during a showing that older residents often can't keep up with property care. This was said while standing in front of my house. The room rippled with murmurs. Denise's eyes widened, not in surprise, but in panic. Another page. April 6th, 5 years ago. Fence line dispute initiated by the Parkers. Despite surveyor confirmation, the fence was fully on my property. Threats of HOA involvement documented. The Parkers glanced down, suddenly more interested in the pattern of the rug. Another page. May 19th, 3 years ago. Denise advises new neighbors to avoid asking Margaret for help with anything technical. She still lives in the past. A low murmur rose, this time sharper. Someone whispered, "I remember that." I paused and looked up, searching the room. Eyes avoided mine, some ashamed, some stunned, some quietly validating what they'd heard, but never confronted. "I've kept these notes," I said gently, not to hold anything over anyone, but to protect myself. It is easy for a single woman of my age to be dismissed, overlooked, or taken advantage of. Documentation isn't retaliation. It's a boundary. No one argued. No one dared. I turned another page, revealing an entry marked with 2 lines, rare emphasis in my normally minimalist system. September 12th, 2 years ago. Denise discourages a seller from accepting an offer from their elderly neighbor, claiming older buyers are unreliable and ineffective at long-term upkeep. A neighbor later confirms the statement. A few gasps escaped around the room. Denise stepped forward, voice sharp with panic. "That is taken out of context. She stopped when she saw the faces around her. Several neighbors looked at her with a mixture of betrayal and recognition. They had suspected. Now they knew. I closed the binder halfway, resting my hand lightly on it. "I never confronted any of you," I said softly. Not because I was afraid, but because I believed in dignity. I believed people would reveal themselves in time, and they always did. My modest lifestyle didn't make me blind or powerless. It simply made me observant. Across the room, someone exhaled shakily. I continued. "My new purchase does not change who I am. I am still the woman who gardens at dawn and walks to the store because she enjoys the morning air. I am still the woman who believes in patience, planning, and quiet perseverance." I let my eyes move deliberately across the room, settling for a moment on each of the faces that had chattered about me, judged me, underestimated me. But what I will no longer accept, I lifted the binder slightly, not as a threat, but as truth, is disrespect disguised as concern, or mistreatment hidden behind polite smiles. Linda's voice finally cracked through the silence. Margaret, we didn't realize... I nodded once. I know you didn't. The Parkers shrank back into their seats, their posture smaller, humbled. They seemed almost grateful I hadn't included more, because the binder held far more entries than I'd revealed. Denise, on the other hand, stood stiffly, her complexion blotched with indignation rather than remorse. This is all exaggerated, she muttered, though her voice trembled. You're twisting things. Before I could respond, a neighbor I barely knew, a quiet man named Jonathan, who rarely attended meetings, stood abruptly. No, Denise, he said. This isn't twisted. I've heard you say things like this. We all have. Another neighbor added, I've seen how you talk about older residents. It's not professional. Then another and another. The murmurs swelled into a tide of accountability. Not loud, not cruel, simply undeniable. For the first time in all the years I'd known her, Denise seemed smaller, not because I'd diminished her, but because her facade had begun to crumble under the weight of her own behavior. I closed the binder gently, the soft click of the metal rings echoing louder than any accusation could. Then I stood. My hands rested lightly against the back of the chair in front of me as I surveyed the room. No anger, no triumph, just calm clarity that had taken years to cultivate. There is one more truth I need to share with all of you, I said quietly, something far more personal than anything in this binder. A stillness settled over the room so complete that even the hum of the refrigerator down the hallway seemed to fade. Every face lifted toward me, every whisper died, every mask, even the most carefully constructed, slipped just a bit. I took a slow breath and prepared to reveal the truth I had held closest of all. I told them the truth I had held close for decades, and it shifted the room in a way no amount of money ever could. When I stood before them, the binder closed, and resting at my side, the room felt heavier than it had all evening. Not hostile, simply braced, suspended, ready to receive something they sensed mattered in a way their whispered concerns never had. My modest lifestyle, I began slowly, was never a sign of poverty, and it was never a sign of weakness. Several neighbors stiffened, as though preparing for a reprimand, but my voice did not rise. It lowered, calm, gentle, steady. It was grief. A murmur, soft, uncertain, rippled through the living room. I kept my gaze steady on the group, letting their discomfort settle. Most of you never met my husband, Michael, I continued. He was a quiet man, thoughtful, patient. He believed in living simply, not because we couldn't do otherwise, but because we wanted to build a life rooted in freedom rather than debt. I folded my hands, feeling the familiar weight of memory press against my chest. When he fell ill, everything changed. Years of treatments, hospital stays, medications, the kind of costs insurance only covers part way, no matter what the brochures promise. A few people shifted in their seats, their faces softening. We used our savings first, then investments, then whatever I could manage alone. I paused, letting the truth hang plainly between us. I lived modestly because I had to. And then, after he passed, I lived modestly because I didn't know how else to be. The room was silent, utterly, achingly silent. Simplicity, I said, became a form of healing, a way to keep the world quiet while I learned how to breathe again. A woman near the corner pressed a hand to her chest, eyes brimming with an emotion that looked very much like guilt. Even the Parkers, who had spent years treating me like an oddity on their street, lowered their gazes, their confidence slipping into something more human. I continued. During that time, some of you mocked my appearance, my home, my old car, my walks to the store. I didn't look at anyone in particular, though many faces tightened with recognition. You did not know the weight I was carrying. You did not ask. Someone in the back whispered, barely audible, "We didn't know." "I understand that," I said gently, but not knowing never stopped anyone from judging. A tremor of remorse moved through the room like a quiet wind. No one tried to speak. No one dared to interrupt. I drew in a slow breath. After Michael passed, I held onto our financial plan because it was the last piece of him I had left. I worked long hours, invested carefully. I studied finance after dinner when the house felt too quiet. I lived simply not to hide anything. My voice softened even further. But to build something he would have been proud of. I saw heads bow, eyes glisten. A few neighbors swallowed hard, trying to keep composure. My financial success didn't appear overnight, I added. It wasn't luck or inheritance or charity. It was slow, disciplined, intentional. 30 years of intention. I let the sentence settle, firm, unembellished truth. So no, I said quietly, buying the historic property is not reckless. It is not a burden. It is the culmination of a plan I began with my husband long before any of you knew my name. Something shifted then, an emotional realignment, subtle yet undeniable. The room that had been filled with suspicion now brimmed with remorse. Even the Parkers, whose earlier bravado had bordered on arrogance, looked genuinely chastened. A neighbor named Teresa, someone who had always greeted me with a polite smile but little more, stepped forward slightly. "Margaret, I'm sorry," she said. "I had no idea. None of us did." Another voice followed. "We shouldn't have judged you." And another. "I feel ashamed." Their words were not dramatic. They were not embellished. They were raw, true, and far more humbling than any apology rehearsed to save face. Not everyone apologized. Some simply stared at the carpet, unable to meet my eyes. A few looked away, cheeks burning with guilt, and one or two slipped toward the door, as though unable to bear the weight of their own behavior. But I didn't speak to punish them. I spoke because truth brings clarity, and clarity brings choice, either to change or to continue in ignorance. "I'm not here to shame anyone," I said. "I'm not angry. I'm simply telling you what I've lived through, and reminding you that you do not always know the stories behind the lives around you." My voice remained steady, anchored in decades of patience, grief, resilience, and healing. Do not underestimate people based on what they choose not to display. Some of us live quietly because we have known loud suffering. No one responded. They didn't need to. I closed my notebook. The binder remained untouched, and with a soft breath, I gave the room what it needed most. "I hope," I said, "we can all move forward with more kindness than before." I stepped back, signaling the end of the meeting. No hostility, no triumph, only dignity. People began to disperse, slowly, cautiously, their eyes avoiding one another. Some stopped to squeeze my hand or whisper apologies. Others left silently, carrying the weight of their own discomfort. As I stepped outside into the cool evening air, the quiet felt like a balm after so many eyes and so many unspoken admissions. The street was dimly lit, shadows stretching long across the pavement. I had taken only a few steps toward my home when I heard hurried footsteps behind me. "Margaret," Denise's voice. I turned. She stood there, her posture stiff, her eyes flickering with something I had never seen in her before. Uncertainty, perhaps fear, perhaps need. Her hands trembled at her sides. "There's something I need to ask you," she said, her voice stripped of its usual confidence, and for the first time I wondered what request could shake a woman like her. Denise's apology was thin, but it was real, and it offered one last chance to choose the kind of woman I wanted to be. The street was quiet except for the hum of a distant street lamp when Denise approached me. Her heels clicked unevenly, a rare falter for someone who usually moved with sharp, rehearsed confidence. When she reached me, she paused, breath catching a little, eyes darting toward the Parkers' house, as if afraid someone might witness her vulnerability. "Margaret," she began, voice barely above a whisper, "I need to apologize." I saw her swallow hard, her throat tightening around words that did not come naturally to her. "I misjudged you," she said, "for years, because of how you lived, because of your age, because I thought I understood everything just by looking." The admission trembled at the edges, thin, unpolished, but true. I waited. "I see now how wrong that was," she continued. "I treated you like a project to fix, or worse, someone beneath me. I shouldn't have. I'm sorry. I let the silence linger long enough for sincerity to settle in, or for falsehood to collapse under its own weight. But Denise did not break. She held my eyes, her own shining faintly under the streetlight. "Thank you," I said at last. "I accept your apology." Relief flickered across her face, brief, fleeting. "But," I added gently, "things won't return to how they were. Not because I'm angry, but because I've learned the value of protecting my peace." She blinked, confusion tugging at her brows. "Respect," I continued, "must be consistent, not reactive. It can't be something you offer only when you discover someone has wealth or influence. It must exist even when you believe someone has nothing to offer you." Her lips parted, then pressed together again. She nodded slowly, as if absorbing a truth she had never examined before. "I understand," she whispered. "Good," I said softly. "Because I won't tolerate being spoken down to. Not by you or anyone else, not anymore." For a long moment she stared at the pavement, nodding faintly. Then she stepped back and murmured, "Thank you for hearing me." I watched her walk away, her silhouette retreating under the streetlight. She seemed smaller now, less polished, less impenetrable, more human. And for the first time since I'd known her, I didn't feel pity. I felt balance, quiet justice, not loud, not vindictive, but earned through truth and time. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood shifted in subtle but unmistakable ways, not because of the house I'd purchased or the headline that had circulated. It changed because people had finally been forced to confront their assumptions. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact now greeted me warmly, not with exaggerated praise, but with genuine respect. Conversations grew softer, more honest. A few even visited the historic property to offer help, hauling debris or clearing the yard. It surprised me at first, but then I realized people often follow the tone that is set for them, and I had set mine with steadiness, not spite. Renovations began early in the winter. I hired local artisans, craftsmen who respected the bones of old homes, who touched wood and stone with reverence rather than haste. Together we uncovered original tile beneath warped flooring, restored stained glass panels, dulled by decades of neglect, and revitalized the stately archway that framed the entrance. One morning, as we were unloading reclaimed lumber, Jonathan, the neighbor who confronted Denise during the meeting, arrived with 2 thermoses of coffee. "For your crew," he said simply. "Thought it might help." Another day, Teresa dropped off historical photos she found tucked in her grandmother's attic. "I thought you'd want to see what the garden looked like in the 40s, she said. Her voice was gentle, thoughtful. Little by little, the house became more than a project. It became a point of shared pride, a reminder of what community could be when stripped of vanity and rebuilt on understanding. And by the time spring came, the transformation felt almost symbolic. The day I moved into the restored home, sunlight poured through the newly polished windows, catching the grain of the wooden floors like liquid gold. I carried with me only a few boxes, essentials, photographs, journals, and the binder that had once summoned silence into a room full of judgment. Standing in the grand foyer, I felt an ache of gratitude settle deep in my ribs, not for the house itself, though it was beautiful, but for the journey that led me there, the steady climb, the quiet work, the dignity held through storms of grief and misunderstanding. I walked through each room slowly, touching walls as though they were old friends. The past I shared with Michael lingered in my memory, but for the first time, it felt like I was walking forward, rather than preserving what once was. Justice, I realize, does not always roar. Sometimes it arrives like morning light, patient, soft, undeniable. Sometimes it is simply the truth revealed at the right moment, to the right audience. That evening, I stood on the back porch, overlooking the revived garden. The soil smelled fresh, rich with possibility. Birds settled into the branches of the old oak, and a breeze brushed against my cheek like a quiet benediction. To the unseen audience, the ones who listen to stories because they need a reminder or a spark or a moment of recognition, I spoke softly. "We are not defined by what people see," I said. "We are defined by the choices we make when no one is looking, by the patience we practice, by the dignity we protect. I let my hands rest on the railing, feeling the steady grain beneath my fingertips. Do not let anyone measure your worth by what they can observe. They will always miss the most important parts. Live quietly if you choose. Live boldly if you must, but live on your own terms. The sky deepened into dusk, painting the world in muted blues and golds. And remember, revenge does not need to be cruel. Sometimes the most powerful justice is simply living well, living honestly, and letting your truth rise to a place where no one can deny it. I breathed in the fading light, feeling the arc of my life settle into something whole, something steady. My name is Margaret Hale, I whispered, and I chose my path. You can choose yours too.